Hi everyone, welcome back. In our daily life, we are surrounded constantly by microbial life. From bacteria and fungi to viruses and all kinds of different stuff. And we're constantly being bombarded by these life forms. They're all over the place. We can't not encounter them. And some of them are pathogenic. They would want to utilize the resources that we have and steal them from us. Yet, we go a lot of our life for long periods of time without actually being sick. So, why is that? How does that happen? Well, we're going to explore with this unit our immune system, and we're going to break it up into three main chunks. The first one is our natural structure of our body and the various defenses that we have. Think about the human body kind of like a castle. You know, picture that in your mind, what a typical castle might look like to you. It has big stone walls, a large gate. It has, it might have a drawbridge that can be, lifted up and lowered down. It might have a moat around it. These are similar to the kinds of defenses that our body would have. Those thick walls of the castle are similar to our skin. A castle might have traps and hazards in it that, is more like our stomach acid. So we have these different structures, these different defenses that we call our barriers to entry that naturally protect us from pathogens. So the first one we're going to talk about is, of course, the skin. How could we not start with the skin? So the skin is really cool for a bunch of different reasons, but one of the big ones is that it's really thick. So when you encounter, say, some bacteria like, for example, Staphylococcus aureus, something that we have on our skin naturally kind of all the time. Well, when it lands on our skin, if it were going to make its way into otherwise sterile parts of our body on the inside, it would have to make its way through many, many dense layers of epithelial tissue. Our epidermis has been compressed substantially, and most of it is dead. And so this is all, essentially resources that cannot be utilized by potential pathogens that would want to get through this layer. They can't be easily bypassed. It's also water repellent. We have a lot of keratin in our skin, and that has a strong water repellent quality. And so this can help essentially like in a wet environment. It can keep things that are easily dissolved in water or like suspended in water, like for example a bacterial cell, from just squeezing by our flattened and compressed epithelial tissue. We also have a lot of hair, because we're mammals that have hair on our skin, and these hairs can help remove debris or keep debris from actually touching the skin, which can also be really helpful in keeping things away. And so when you have an injury to the skin, that is often a major route that allows pathogens to actually bypass that defense. There are not as many pathogens that can move through the epidermis and dermis on their own. In addition to our skin, we also have secretion, just different methods of secretion and different secretions that help us protect the body. So some of those include our earwax, our mucus, things like that. These are really useful for actually like collecting and trapping a lot of potential invaders that make their way into these different orifices of our body. So our earwax is really waxy, obviously. It's got a lot of long-chain fatty acids that make them take on this very waxy, structure. And this is really good because bacteria, as they might, naturally move through the ear, either by them like swimming through, like liquid that might make its way into the ear, or be blown into the ear, or things like that. That they are often trapped by earwax, and earwax is constantly being secreted, and it's constantly being removed over time from the ear. It doesn't usually stay in the ear for a long time. There's a constant turnover. Similarly, mucus in our respiratory system especially is really useful for this as well. So mucus is a combination of fluid, just like water, and mucins, which are special proteins that give the mucus that nasty, snotty texture. That texture is important though because it's something that it's gelatinous, and there are not a lot of things that can easily swim through that medium, and so it can be a barrier to some bacteria, for example, that might get stuck in the mucus. And then we have special cells that can actually help remove that mucus. A lot of it is moved up and up and up out of the respiratory tract, and moved into either your esophagus where you go to swallow it, or you might like cough or sneeze it out or things like that. The ciliary cells that are in our respiratory tract are the ones that really do this job. And this is a super cool process. So we have these goblet cells that are constantly secreting mucus. And if we didn't have ciliary cells that were doing this job of removing this mucus, it would constantly build up, and we might even drown in our own lungs with the mucus. So that'd be pretty bad. Not to mention the fact that if something, a pathogen comes in and is stuck in the mucus, well, it could survive there and replicate and continue to be a problem if it wasn't removed. And so the ciliary escalator is the action, the process by which these ciliary cells that line our respiratory tract actually beat their cilia and move this medium up and up and up against gravity, up and up and up out of our respiratory tract, and then moved again usually into the esophagus, like over the epiglottis, and then into the esophagus for us to swallow. Most of it is swallowed, but again, you could also hack and cough it up and things like that. We also have a lot of those traps that we have talked about before that are not just like sticky traps. They can also be destructive. And so we have some places in our body that are inhospitable to certain pathogens. For example, our stomach. If you're going to get a stomach bug, for example, a bacterium that makes its way through the stomach and into the intestines in order to cause intestinal distress, well, it's going to have to survive exposure to really high acidity. An extremely acidic environment, otherwise a very low pH. So your stomach usually sits around a pH of 1.5 to 3.5. That's really acidic. This is mainly because we produce hydrochloric acid and a variety of enzymes that help break down things that are that we swallow and bring into the stomach. It's the job of the stomach to actually break down a lot of things and digest them. And so this acid, this highly acidic environment, is a really good deterrent for a lot of living things that would otherwise really like to make their way into your intestines. A lot of potential invaders can be outright killed when they're exposed to this acidic environment, and so it can be a really good form of control. We also have this really interesting ability to actually produce additional secretions that are not just, like stomach acid and earwax, things like that. We can actually make things with more significant function, like actually an antimicrobial function. So in a lot of our secretions, like tears and saliva and even breast milk, these secretions contain something called lysozyme, and so these places can also be, this media can also be a place where we place antimicrobial compounds so that when they come into contact with bacteria, they can actually break that stuff down. So lysozyme is a really cool example of this that humans make. So it's not all just fungi and bacteria that make antibiotics. Humans can also make these things, although our repertoire is much smaller by comparison. But lysozyme is really neat. It has this cool ability to kind of wedge itself into the cell wall of bacteria and disrupt it. It actually causes a break. So it can, unlike something like penicillin, which mainly causes problems for bacteria by stopping the bacteria from repairing its own cell wall, lysozyme can actually disrupt and break the cell wall. So it's mainly useful for gram-positive bacterial cells because, again, you need to have exposure to that cell wall. If you don't have the ability for lysozyme to meet up with the cell wall, there's not going to be much of an effect. So that's a really important aspect here. But lysozyme's super neat. It's present in all three of these secretions up here: tears, saliva, and breast milk. We also have another defense, which we don't always think about, but it's our microbiome. So we have a really robust microbiome that lives inside our body and on our body's surface that, this resident microbiota of ours that does a really good job of protecting us. Now, there's a bunch of things that this, this microbiome does for us. It helps us digest food, for example. It's a really important job that it does. But one of the other, perhaps lesser known jobs that this microbiome does for us is actually in defense. It's in defense against other microbes, particularly bacteria and fungi. So our body is already colonized. It's already colonized by a lot of other microbes. They live here. And so our resident microbiome is well established. And while it's not impossible to change that resident microbiome, they kind of have an edge. They've established in one place, and they've essentially laid claim to your body, to that whatever that specific region of your body is, and they, just like anyone would do, they want to defend their home. They want to protect themselves and make sure they're not displaced by another bacteria that comes in and wants to live where they live, like in the exact spot that they are currently living. And so microbes will actually engage in a lot of this, what you might call chemical warfare, where they produce a lot of antimicrobial compounds, right? A lot of antibiotics, a lot of antibacterials and antifungals and things like that, where they will fight with one another. And the bacteria who are the better competitors are the ones that stick it out, that they are able to survive in that environment and not be dislodged, or if they are the better competitor, to dislodge somebody that, a bacteria that's already there, so that they can become resident microbiota. So this, what we call sometimes competitive exclusion, is something that happens in our microbiome that helps us. It works to our benefit, protecting our body from potential invaders that are oftentimes, because there are fewer of them and they're kind of on their back foot, they have a harder time establishing in a place where there are already a lot of microbes that are very successful. So again, this microbiome, it's a shifting community. There's a lot of different factors that go into determining, who lives where. We have inside of our body or on the surface of our body, whatever we're talking about, we have specific environmental conditions that some bacteria are going to be better at utilizing than others. And the species that are really good at utilizing those, to living in those conditions, they're going to be the ones that survive best. They're going to be the best competitors. So it's, important to note also that if you change those environments, if you if something happens to make those environments different in some way, then you can also change who can effectively survive in or on your body. An example of that might be this. Imagine that you happen to take a lot of antacids. Okay, you take a lot of antacids. Well, that will reduce the pH of your stomach, and that can be a problem for a bunch of reasons. There are also some species that love the highly acidic environment of your stomach. We've mentioned acidophiles before, and some species thrive under those conditions. If you change those conditions, you may make those environments less appealing for those species. That these acidophiles, if the stomach becomes more neutral, might not be able to survive as well in the stomach under those conditions. That said, it might also cause other problems too, because going back here, the acid is also a very significant deterrent for colonizing microbes. You have to be able to bypass this acidic environment, this acid barrier, and if that acid is not as strong, if it's a weak acid, if it's more neutral because you're pounding back the Tums, well, that can actually have a detrimental effect on your body as well, because it can reduce the effectiveness of this barrier. So a potential pathogen might have an easier time getting into your intestines. There's a lot of other things that you can do to change this environment. Changing the things that you eat, for example, the kinds of nutrition, the things you put in your body. Also, changing the microbial community itself, changing who lives there. For example, taking a broad spectrum antibiotic and eliminating a bunch of these different microbes that have established here. That can cause a serious problem. So, this can be a big issue. When you have a very healthy gut microbiome, these environments can be very resistant against potential invaders. But you have, a stomach bug and you start treating it with, or you don't even have a stomach bug. Say you have some kind of skin infection or something like that. You took antibiotics for it. Well, the antibiotics, if they were broad spectrum, they probably are not just killing the thing that you are treating. They're killing a lot of other microbes too, including the stuff in your stomach. And so if you reduce those communities, you make them less diverse, eliminating, say, this bacterium and this bacterium, you may open up a space for something more problematic to come in and establish, like, for example, Clostridium difficile, which is a type of opportunistic pathogen that does take advantage of people that are coming off of antibiotic treatments, for example. It's a common nosocomial infection. So there's, all things considered, when we talk about bypassing those defenses, in order to actually infect a person, a pathogen has to bypass those defenses in one way or another. And there's a few different ways that can be accomplished. One of them is simply physically bypassing some barrier, right? So, like, for example, an injury is a really easy way to physically bypass a barrier. If you are walking around in a construction site and you step on a nail, you've stabbed your foot with a nail, and bacteria that were on the nail have now been pushed up through the epidermis and into the dermis and maybe even further, causing more significant damage and getting past this major barrier. You could also have a natural sort of the bacteria itself is capable of getting past a barrier on its own. So remember that, a lot of these pathogens have evolved to be effective pathogens for humans. not always the case, is it, that all of our pathogens, it's not the case that all of our pathogens are, opportunistic. A lot of our pathogens are actually well evolved to utilize our body. And so that also means they are evolved to get past our defenses, to actually, potentially infect, say, the dermis, to get through the epidermis to reach the dermis, or things like that. To actually swim through mucus, to actually survive the environment of the stomach. And then you could also have a change to your body, that, to your environment, that alters the conditions and makes it easier for something to establish. Okay, for example, taking antibiotics can eliminate some part of your microbiome, and therefore, change the environment and make it more appealing and easier for something new to establish, something more problematic potentially to establish.